Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into a topic that I find incredibly fascinating: human learning and memory.
Yeah, learning and memory, such an interesting area. It's how we acquire knowledge, skills, hold on to it, and, sometimes we even lose it. And there's so many factors that influence how this all happens.
Exactly. And we've got a lot of research here, some really interesting stuff that I think will challenge what people think they know about how their brains work.
Oh, for sure.
Um, from those classic experiments like Pavlov's dogs all the way to like the latest in neural networks and AI. So, get ready for some real aha moments.
Definitely. And one of the most fascinating things is just how interconnected it all is. It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about attention, emotion, motivation, and all of these play a role in shaping how we learn and remember things.
Okay, so before we dive right in, I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage a little bit. Our sources, one of the things they emphasize is this idea that behavior is lawful. What that basically means is that our actions aren't just random. They're influenced by things like our environment, the world around us, and also our genes, our biology.
Right. And that was like revolutionary at the time. It shifted the focus away from introspection, which is basically just asking people about their thoughts and feelings, to actually observing behavior in a controlled setting.
It's kind of funny to imagine like 100 years ago, scientists just saying, hey, tell me what you're thinking, and calling it research.
Exactly. Yeah, so much bias and limitations. That's why experiments, actually observing and controlling things became so crucial, because you can isolate specific factors and then see how those affect behavior.
Now, speaking of experiments, one of our sources talks about this really cool study, and it involved a chimpanzee named Washoe.
Oh, yeah.
And they actually taught her sign language. I mean, how amazing is that?
That is incredible. And it really highlights the power of associative learning, which is one of the, cornerstones of this whole field.
And this idea of associative learning, this is going to be a key concept that we keep coming back to, right? So just to
Yeah.
make sure I'm on the same page, like if I touch a hot stove and I burn myself, that pain teaches me to associate the stove with danger. So next time I'm not going to touch it.
You got it. That is a perfect example of associative learning in action. And, we can break that down even further into two main types. There's classical conditioning and then there's operant conditioning.
Right. So classical conditioning, this is where Pavlov's dogs come in. Like everyone's heard of Pavlov's dogs. They learn to associate the bell with food. So eventually just hearing the bell makes them drool, even if there's no food present.
Yeah, that's the classic example. But what's really fascinating is that, Pavlov's work went beyond just drooling dogs. He also did research on conditioning, like autonomic responses, so things like blood sugar levels, even pain perception.
Wait, so you're saying that pain can be like conditioned? Like you could train someone to experience pain just by, I don't know, like showing them a certain image or something?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but the research does suggest that our experiences with pain, they can be influenced by learned associations. So, like, the point is that classical conditioning, it's not just about simple reflexes. Our understanding has, it's evolved a lot since those early experiments.
Okay, so what did those early researchers, what did they kind of get wrong about classical conditioning? Like, where did their thinking evolve?
Yeah, so initially they thought it was all about contiguity. So this idea that if two things happen close together in time, then that's all it takes to create an association in the brain. But then research started to reveal things like preparedness, contingency, and blocking.
Okay, I'm going to need to unpack those terms because I'm not familiar with those.
Sure, so let's start with preparedness. This is the idea that, because of our evolutionary history, the way our brains are wired, we're kind of biologically predisposed to learn certain associations much easier than others.
Okay, so like some things are just kind of easier to connect in our brains, like
Yeah.
hardwired because of evolution.
Exactly, precisely. So, for example, we're naturally inclined to associate nausea with taste, like if we eat something that makes us sick,
Right, of course.
which makes sense, right? From a survival perspective, you eat a berry, it makes you sick, you're not going to want to eat another one.
Right, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about preparedness. What about contingency and blocking?
Okay, so contingency builds on that idea. It's about the reliability of the association. So it's not enough for like the bell and the food to just happen together sometimes. There has to be a consistent, predictable relationship between them.
So like if the bell rings randomly, regardless of whether there's food or not, the dogs wouldn't really make the connection.
Exactly. The bell has to be a reliable signal. a predictor that the food is coming for the association to form. Now, blocking, that's when a previously learned association actually blocks a new association from forming.
Okay, that's interesting. How does that work?
So imagine our dogs, they've already learned to associate the bell with food.
Okay.
And then we start flashing a light along with the bell right before the food appears. Because the bell is already a strong predictor, the light doesn't add any new information. It's not a surprise.
Ah, I see. So the dogs basically just ignore the light because the bell already tells them everything they need to know.
Exactly, that's blocking. And it suggests that our brains are actively trying to, make sense of the world and predict what's going to happen next.
It's not just like mindless repetition. It's figuring out the rules of the game. Like, okay, this leads to that. Okay, so then where does the idea of surprise, like where does surprise fit into all this?
That's where this model comes in. It's called the Rescorla-Wagner model, and what it suggests is that the amount of learning that happens on any given trial, it depends on how unexpected the outcome is. So the more surprised we are, the more we pay attention and try to figure out what's going on.
So if those dogs get food after the bell, like every single time, they're not really learning anything new. But if like maybe sometimes the food appears without the bell, then their brains really kick into gear.
Exactly. It's that element of surprise that drives learning. And, this kind of leads us to the fascinating world of cognitive theories of learning. Researchers started realizing that maybe it's not just about these simple associations, maybe it's also about forming expectations, like higher level thinking is involved.
Okay, so how do we know if it's a simple association or if it's like a conscious expectation? Like, what's the difference?
Right. Well, there's this intriguing theory called the two-system hypothesis, and it suggests that there are two different systems in the brain that are involved in learning. We have our associative system, which is kind of unconscious and automatic, and then we have a cognitive system, which is conscious and involves these expectations.
So sometimes we might be like conditioned to respond to something without even realizing it.
Right.
And then other times we might be consciously aware of that association and actively predicting what's going to happen.
Exactly. And there's some really compelling research that supports this. Like, for example, there was this study, I think it was called the Hefferline experiment, where participants, they learned to make these tiny thumb twitches to stop a noise, even though they weren't consciously aware of the connection.
That's crazy. It's like our brains are learning these things without us even knowing. And remember, we were talking about amnesia earlier.
Yes.
So there's this research that shows that people with amnesia, they can still exhibit fear conditioning, even if they don't consciously remember the conditioning experience itself.
It's mind-blowing.
It really is. Like, even if you can't consciously remember something, your body might still be reacting to it. That's creepy, but it's also amazing.
Ah.
But hold on, we've been so deep in the world of classical conditioning. Where does operant conditioning fit into all of this?
Right. That's a great question. And that's actually where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how consequences shape our behavior and how rewards and punishments influence what we learn and how this connects to the bigger picture of, how our brains create and store memories.
Well, I'm definitely ready for more. To our listeners, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve into that fascinating world of operant conditioning.
Welcome back to our deep dive into human learning and memory.
Last time we were talking about this wild idea that, like, our brains could be learning stuff without us even realizing it. It makes you wonder, what else is going on in there that we're not aware of?
Right, and that's what makes this topic so fascinating. There's always more to uncover, always more to learn. And today, we're shifting gears a little bit to talk about operant conditioning. So this focuses on how consequences shape our behavior.
Okay, so instead of just passively associating things like, with classical conditioning, this is more about how our actions, what we do, influences what happens next.
Exactly, yeah. It's about learning through rewards and punishments. So if a behavior leads to something pleasurable, we're more likely to repeat it, do it again. But if it leads to something unpleasant, well, we're probably going to avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty intuitive, but I'm guessing it's a lot more complicated than just, do good things, get good stuff, do bad things, get bad stuff.
Of course, there are always nuances, right? So, for example, we can talk about the different types of reinforcers. So, we have primary reinforcers, which are things that are just inherently rewarding, like we're biologically wired to desire them. So things like food, water, physical touch, that sort of thing.
Right. And then we have secondary reinforcers.
Yeah.
So those are things that, like, they acquire their value through learning.
Exactly. Precisely. So things like, money, praise, good grades, those things, they don't have any inherent value in and of themselves, but we learn to associate them with these positive outcomes.
Yeah, like money's just paper,
Yeah,
but we learn that it can buy us things that we want and need, so it becomes like a really powerful motivator.
exactly. Yeah. And what's fascinating is that what's reinforcing for one person, it might not be reinforcing for another person. It all depends on individual preferences and experiences.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to motivation. You have to figure out what works for each individual.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is where things can get a bit tricky, especially when we start talking about punishment. So while the goal of punishment is to decrease a behavior, make it less likely to happen, there are all these different types of punishment, and the effectiveness, can really vary depending on how it's used.
Right, because punishment can have unintended consequences too, right?
Yeah.
Like it can create fear, resentment if it's not used very carefully.
Exactly. Yeah. And, our sources really dive into some of these critical factors that influence whether or not punishment is effective. So, for example, immediacy is like really key. The closer the punishment is to the behavior, the stronger the association will be.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you wait too long to deliver the punishment, like the connection between the action and the consequence, it just weakens, right? It's like if you scold a dog hours after they chewed on your shoe, they're not going to know why they're in trouble.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And another factor is consistency. The punishment needs to be delivered reliably every time the behavior occurs. Otherwise, the person or animal might learn that, hey, I can sometimes get away with this.
So it's not just about how severe the punishment is. It's about the timing and the consistency too.
Exactly. And it's also important to consider the context. So sometimes punishment, it might only be effective in a specific environment. Like, for example, imagine a child who's punished for talking out of turn in a classroom. They might learn to be quiet in class, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll generalize that behavior to other settings, other places.
Yeah, so they might still be talking out of turn at home or, on the playground because like that association between talking and punishment is specific to the classroom.
Precisely. Yeah. It's fascinating how context can really shape our learning. So, let's kind of shift gears here a little bit and talk about, how these principles of reinforcement and punishment, like how can we actually apply those to, real world situations? So one area where operant conditioning has been really influential is in education.
Oh, that makes sense. Like using positive reinforcement to encourage students to participate in class or complete their assignments.
Exactly. Yeah. So teachers can use things like, praise, stickers, or even just, a simple good job to, really strengthen those desired behaviors, make them more likely to happen. And then there's the concept of shaping, which is where you gradually reinforce behaviors that are, kind of getting closer and closer to that, target behavior that you're trying to achieve.
So like, instead of expecting a student to just write this like perfect essay right off the bat,
Yeah.
you might reinforce them for completing an outline or, for writing a first draft
Uh-huh.
and then kind of build up to that final product.
Exactly, you got it. It's about breaking down a complex task into these, smaller, more manageable steps. And then, you're providing that reinforcement along the way.
I like that. And, opera conditioning, it's not just limited to the classroom, right? I mean, it's used in therapy as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So therapists use all sorts of techniques that are based on, these principles of operant conditioning to help people, work through things like phobias or addictions, those kinds of behavioral issues. And so like one common approach is called systematic desensitization. And this is where, a person is gradually exposed to the thing that they fear while they're engaging in relaxation techniques.
So like if someone has a fear of spiders, like a really bad fear of spiders, you might start by showing them pictures of spiders while they're practicing deep breathing. And then eventually, you might actually bring a spider into the room, maybe from a distance at first, but, maybe eventually they might even be able to like hold the spider.
Yeah, exactly. So by pairing the feared object with relaxation, you can gradually change the person's association with that object, and reduce their fear response. And this technique has been incredibly effective for, treating, a wide range of phobias.
It's pretty amazing how powerful these principles can be when they're, applied strategically.
Yeah, it really is.
But, what about the legal system? Like, how does operant conditioning factor into like, the criminal justice system.
Well, it's a very complex issue, but I think understanding the principles of reinforcement and punishment, it can really help us create more effective criminal justice policies. So, for example, some people argue that focusing on rehabilitation programs, programs that really reinforce those positive behaviors, that might be a more effective approach to reducing crime, instead of just focusing solely on punishment.
So instead of just locking people up, and kind of hoping for the best, we could focus on giving them the skills and support they need to like make positive changes in their lives.
Exactly, exactly. So, this could involve things like, job training programs
Oh,
or, educational opportunities, substance abuse treatment, that
okay.
kind of thing. And so by providing that positive reinforcement for, pro-social behaviors, we might actually be able to break that cycle of criminal behavior.
It's an interesting idea, and it really highlights the practical implications of like, understanding these fundamental principles of learning.
Absolutely.
But okay, so before we like, get too deep into, like the societal implications and all that, let's shift our focus to like the inner workings of memory itself. So we've talked about how we acquire information, through classical and operant conditioning. But how do we actually store and retrieve those memories? Like where does all this information go and how do we access it when we need it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And that's what we're going to talk about on the next part of our deep dive. We're going to get into those different memory systems, and how we encode those memories, how we consolidate them, and how we retrieve them. It's a fascinating journey.
I'm ready for it. So to our listeners, stay tuned for part 3, where we'll unlock the secrets of how we remember and why we sometimes forget. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on quite a journey exploring the world of human learning, from those drooling dogs to the power of rewards and punishments. And now we're finally here. The grand finale, the fascinating world of human memory.
Yeah, memory is where all the magic happens, right? It's how we store all those experiences, the facts, the skills that we've learned.
Right? It's like this massive mental library, but
Mhm.
how's it organized? Our sources, they talk about these different types of memory systems. Can you break those down for us?
Absolutely. So, think of it this way. Our brains, they don't just have one giant storage bin for memories. We have these specialized systems for different kinds of information. One of the key distinctions is between episodic memory and semantic memory.
Okay, so what's the difference? When I hear episodic memory, I'm kind of picturing like a TV show, with all these distinct episodes from our lives.
Yeah, you're on the right track. Episodic memory, it's all about personal experiences, those specific events, those episodes of your life. So like what you had for breakfast this morning or, that embarrassing moment back in high school that you'd rather just forget.
And then semantic memory, that's more like our vast encyclopedia of facts and general knowledge about the world.
Exactly. So it's your memory for things like, knowing that Paris is the capital of France or that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, those kinds of facts.
Mhm.
It's not tied to any specific personal experience.
So episodic memory is more like, I remember the time and then semantic memory is, I know that.
Perfect. That's a great way to put it. And what's really fascinating is that these systems can operate independently. Like, for example, people with amnesia, they might lose their episodic memory, but still retain their semantic memory.
So they could forget their own wedding day, but still remember all the rules of chess or something.
Precisely. It's incredible, isn't it? It really shows how specialized these memory systems are. But wait, there's more. We also have something called procedural memory. And this
Hmm.
is where we store our knowledge of how to do things. So it's our memory for skills and habits.
Oh, okay. So like riding a bike or playing the piano, even tying your shoes, those things you can just kind of do without thinking about it too much.
Exactly. Once you've learned these skills, they become almost automatic. You don't have to consciously recall all those steps each time you do them.
It's like our bodies just remember how to move, even if we can't explain it.
Mm.
Pretty amazing. Okay, so we've got all these different memory systems, but how does the information actually get into them in the first place?
Right, good question. That's where encoding comes in. So encoding is the process of transforming information into a format that our brains can actually store in memory. And our sources highlight some key factors that influence how well we encode information. One of those is organization. It's much easier to remember things if we can organize them in a meaningful way, create some structure.
So like if I'm trying to remember a grocery list, it's better to like Group the items by category, like
Right.
produce dairy snacks instead of just having this random list of words.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. When we create those structures, it helps our brains make sense of the information and then store it more efficiently. Another important factor is elaboration, which is basically making connections between the new information and things that we already know.
Right.
So the more we can link new ideas to that existing knowledge, the more likely those ideas are to stick.
Okay, so like if I'm learning about a new historical event, it would be helpful to try and connect it to other events that I already know about, or
Yeah.
like think about how it relates to, current events maybe.
Exactly. You're making those connections, creating that web of associations in your mind. And then there's depth of processing, which is basically how deeply we think about the information. So it's not just about, rote memorization or repetition. It's about really engaging with the material in a meaningful way. The more we analyze, interpret, connect with the information, the stronger that memory trace will be.
This makes me think about that study where um, they had people try to remember a list of words, and they asked some people to just, count the syllables, like how many syllables are in each word. But then they asked other people to like really imagine using that object in like a survival scenario. And the people who imagined using the objects, they remembered way more words. It's like their brains were working harder to process the information, because it was more relevant to them.
Right. And that's a perfect example of how that active engagement leads to much more robust encoding. But, even after we've carefully encoded information, there's still a chance we might forget it. Our memories, they're not permanent, unfortunately. They can fade or even become distorted over time.
So is there anything we can do to like prevent forgetting and improve our ability to actually recall information when we need it?
Yeah, definitely. And that's where retrieval strategies come in. And one really powerful technique is called retrieval practice. So this is the idea that actively trying to recall information from memory that actually strengthens the memory trace, making it more likely that you'll remember it in the future.
So it's not enough to just like read something over and over again. We have to actually quiz ourselves and
Yeah.
try to retrieve the information without looking at the answers.
Exactly. Exactly. You've got to make your brain work for it. It forces your brain to work harder. It strengthens those neural pathways that are associated with that memory. And another effective technique is called spaced repetition.
Now that sounds familiar. I think we talked about that earlier, like in the context of learning.
We did. You're right. We mentioned it as a way to enhance encoding, but it's also incredibly beneficial for retrieval. So the idea here is that spreading out your study sessions over time, instead of cramming everything all at once, it actually leads to much better long-term retention.
So if I'm, studying for an exam, it's better to like review the material a little bit every day, maybe for a week, instead of trying to cram it all in the night before.
Exactly. So each time you revisit the material, you're reactivating those neural pathways, and you're making the memory stronger, more resistant to forgetting. And here's another really intriguing finding. Our memories are context dependent.
Context dependent, what does that mean?
Well, it means that we're more likely to remember something if we're in the same environment or state of mind as when we initially learned it. So, for example, if you study for a test in a specific room, you might actually perform better on that test if you take it in that same room.
Really? So like our surroundings and even our emotions, they can act as these retrieval cues. That's wild.
It is. It suggests that, our memories are they're intricately intertwined with the context in which they were formed. And this kind of brings us to a really crucial point. Memory, it's not a perfect recording of the past. It's a reconstructive process, It's influenced by our current knowledge, our beliefs, even our emotions.
So you're saying that our memories aren't like these perfect video replays. They're more like stories that we tell ourselves. And the stories, they can change over time.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. Every time we retrieve a memory, we're essentially rewriting it.
Yeah.
Maybe we're adding some details, omitting others, reinterpreting events based on our current perspective. And, this has some pretty profound implications, especially when we consider things like the reliability of eyewitness testimony.
Right. Because we talked earlier about, how leading questions can actually influence memory.
Yeah.
But this idea that like memory is a reconstruction, that's even more like unsettling because it suggests that even our most vivid memories, they might not be completely accurate.
It's a sobering thought. It really highlights the importance of being critical of our own memories, especially when the stakes are high, like in legal proceedings or something like that.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the world of human learning and memory. I mean, we've explored how we acquire information, how we store it, and even why we forget. We've even learned some practical strategies to, like, try to improve our own memories, be more aware of their limitations.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that our brains are constantly learning and adapting and, just reshaping our understanding of the world around us.
It really is amazing. To our listeners, keep those brains engaged, stay curious, and never stop exploring this fascinating world of the human mind. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.